The fog was thicker than anything Jacob had ever seen. It wrapped around the ship like a shroud, muffling voices, hiding faces, and dulling the distant silhouette of the Statue of Liberty that so many others stared at in awe. For Jacob, it felt less like a welcome and more like a warning, a whisper from the sea that not all who arrive would be remembered. He held his coat tight around him and clutched the worn leather journal against his chest. It was the only thing he hadn't let go of in weeks. Inside were pages of quiet entries, memories of home, names of those he'd left behind, and his own name written over and over again, Jacob Novak, Jacob Novak. Jacob moved with the others across the damp wooden dock, boots thudding against planks soaked with brine and history. Every few seconds, someone coughed, a sharp, wet sound, and Jacob instinctively stepped away. Jacob Novak. Jacob wondered how many had arrived before him, how many had passed through, and how many had... The officers barked orders in English, German, Italian, and a few rough Polish phrases urging the passengers into lines. The Ellis Island station loomed ahead, a red brick fortress of bureaucracy and hope. Windows watched them like eyes. As the line inched forward, a soft voice reached his ear, cutting through the drone of orders and footsteps. They can't take it unless you give it up. You must keep your name. The room held 20 bunks, all filled with the exhausted, the sick, the hopeful. But despite the packed space, it was too quiet. It's the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until your own heartbeat feels like a drum. The fog was so thick I could have stepped off the ship and into a dream or something else. I met a woman who told me to keep my name. I have written it 3 times tonight, just in case I forget. Jacob turned. Beside him stood a frail old woman, wrapped in a gray shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Slow, deliberate. Then a door creaked. Then silence. Older, faded. And it wasn't his handwriting. Her eyes were glassy, not with age, but with something deeper, something hollow. "They take it if you forget," she said in Polish. "Your name." Bee voices called from beneath the surface, asking him questions he couldn't understand, in languages he'd never heard. Jacob frowned. "I don't understand. Just a dent in the pillow, and the faint warmth left behind." But she was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. He was assigned a bunk in the quarantine dormitory, given a tin plate and a wool blanket, and told to wait. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps it was the fog still clinging to his mind. As he finished the 3rd repetition, he noticed something odd. By the time he entered the registration hall, the fog outside had seeped into his bones. "Wait for what?" he asked in broken English. The attendant only shrugged. "Your turn." That night, he lay in the narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. Jacob opened his journal and began to write. "Today I arrived in America, I think." He paused, the pen hovering over the page. From the hallway beyond the dormitory, he heard footsteps. He listened harder. Another creak, a whisper. No. Just the wind, maybe. Jacob turned to the next page and wrote his name again in large, careful letters. The top of the page, just faintly, a 4th Jacob Novak appeared, but the ink was different. He closed the book slowly and pressed it against his chest, his fingers trembling just a little. Sleep took him some time near midnight, but his dreams were full of water and whispers. When he awoke, someone in the next bunk was gone. No one mentioned it. No one asked. Jacob opened his journal again. "If I do not write it, will I forget it? If they call the wrong name, do I still become it?" He did not know the answers. But he knew one thing. He would write his name every day until someone called it aloud and meant it. The second morning came like a mirror of the first. Same whistle from the hallway, same metallic clang of breakfast trays, same dull gray light filtering through the dormitory window, casting long lines across the floor like prison bars. Jacob sat up slowly. He half expected the fog to have followed him inside, filling the room with soft mist and cold salt. 20 bunks, 20 souls. Or so he thought. But when he counted, he only saw 19. But the air was still and dry, unnaturally so. No suitcase, no blanket, no shoes. As if he had never been there at all. Round him the others stirred, yawning and rising. The bunk next to his, the one where the man from Hungary had slept, was empty. Jacob stood and looked. He turned to the man in the opposite bunk, a burly Italian with a thick black beard. His name was, but the name wouldn't come. Luca was quick to laugh, quick to smile. He shared his bread and stories about the bay in his hometown, the sea so blue it sang when the wind hit it. He searched his memory, but it was like trying to catch smoke. He could picture the man's face, but the sound of his voice was already fading. "Do you know where the Hungarian man went?" Jacob asked in slow English. The man blinked. "What Hungarian?" His blanket folded, and on the pillow, a single breadcrumb. "The one in that bed," Jacob said, pointing. "There was no one there last night. They will call our names soon." Not even the bearded Italian, who had joked with him just the night before. The pages were just as he'd left them. But at the bottom of the most recent entry, a single word had appeared in faded pencil. Jacob felt a cold spot open at the base of his spine. Yes, there was. "We spoke. We're lucky. No fever, no injuries. We just need a little patience." On the fourth day's entry, he saw another name lightly etched in the margin. Only the wind, whistling gently against the old window panes. He slept deeper than usual, lulled by Luca's confidence. Later that day, while waiting in the main hall for the next round of health inspections, Jacob struck up conversation with a young man named Luca from Naples. Narrow halls that led nowhere. The longer he stayed, the more the building seemed to shift, breathing, expanding, rearranging itself when no one looked. It felt good to talk to someone who remembered how to dream. "I think we'll get through this in a few days," Luca said.
"Art on it," someone had carved crudely but clearly. Jacob nodded, grateful.
That night, Jacob didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear whispers. When he awoke, the sun was already rising, and Luca's bunk was empty. At first, Jacob thought perhaps he had gone early to breakfast. But then he saw that Luca's shoes were still under the bed. Jacob asked everyone. No one remembered Luca. And the Hungarian, his name came back, but only because it was written. "I think the journal remembers for me, not the attendants, not the other men in the room." Jacob opened his journal. Luca. He hadn't written it. The handwriting was slanted differently, more elegant, almost rushed. He flipped back through earlier pages, scanning them closely. That was the Hungarian man's name, the one he had forgotten. But who had written them? That afternoon, Jacob wandered the dormitory alone. He passed doorways that shouldn't have existed. In a dusty corridor behind the medical ward, he saw a wooden door that had not been there the day before. "Do not answer if they call your name." He didn't touch the handle. That evening, he wrote in his journal with shaking hands. "Luca is gone. No one remembers him but me." He underlined his name 6 times. Then closed the book and held it close like a lifeline. As he drifted off, the building creaked. Long, slow groans like a ship lost at sea. Somewhere in the silence, he thought he heard breathing. Not from the other men, from the walls. The third night was colder. Jacob pulled the rough wool blanket over his shoulders, but the draft still slipped through the cracks of the window pane, finding his skin like cold fingers. Sleep came slowly, clinging to the edges of wakefulness. And each time he drifted off, a creak from the hallway pulled him back. It was nearly midnight when he heard the footsteps. Not hurried like the attendants, not heavy like the guards. These were slow, even deliberate, as if each step had a purpose, as if each footfall was measuring the space between something forgotten and something remembered. Jacob sat up, heart pounding. He turned toward the door. Footsteps passed, soft against the worn wood floor, and then ... stopped. He held his breath. Through the narrow window in the door, he saw a figure standing in the hallway. A tall man, dressed in a long coat, dark as ink. He didn't move, didn't look in, just stood, like he was waiting for something. Jacob blinked. The light above the hallway flickered once, and that's when Jacob noticed. The man had no shadow. The wall behind him was bare. No outline, no silhouette, no evidence of his presence at all, as though the light refused to touch him. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much, and forgotten even more. There was no malice in them, no emotion at all. just a stillness that made Jacob's skin prickle. Then the man turned his head slowly, as if he had heard Jacob's thoughts. Their eyes met. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was pale, expressionless, but his eyes. Then, without a word, the man walked on. Jacob didn't sleep after that, as if no one had disappeared, as if no man had ever walked the hall with footsteps like a metronome and a face like a forgotten dream. In the morning, he asked one of the attendants about the man in the coat. Tall, black coat, pale face, no shadow. The attendant gave him a strange look. There's no one like that here. But at the bottom of the page, in that same unfamiliar hand, someone had drawn a sketch. He was in the hall, Jacob insisted. The attendant laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You should drink more water. That day, Jacob kept to himself. He didn't speak to the others. He watched their faces, waiting for recognition. Some shared glance. A flicker of confusion, a hint that someone else had seen what he had. But everyone went on as if nothing had happened. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Back in his bunk that night, Jacob opened his journal. But someone else drew him in my journal. Who am I not alone in this place? The pages had changed again. Not the words he had written. Those were still there, though his handwriting had grown more frantic. It was crude. It's just pencil on paper. But Jacob recognized it instantly. In the distance, a ship approached, slow and silent. And at the helm stood the man in the black coat. The man in the coat, his face, his posture, his presence. And beneath the sketch, a single phrase had been written. He watches those who write. Jacob stared at the words, then tore the page from the book and shoved it deep into his suitcase, wrapping it inside his spare shirt. He returned to the journal and wrote slowly. Last night, I saw a man with no shadow. He stood at my door and stared. Today they tell me he doesn't exist. He hesitated, and added, Or is it me who's disappearing, little by little? That night, his dreams were darker. He stood alone on a dock, fog swirling around him, the sound of waves lapping gently at his feet. Only this time he spoke. But Jacob couldn't understand the words. They weren't in Polish, or English, or any language he'd ever heard. Still, some part of him understood. The man was not asking permission. He was warning Jacob that the time was coming. The time when names would mean nothing, when memory would fade like a photograph left in the sun. Jacob awoke with a start. His blanket was gone. And beside his bed, wet footprints led away down the hall. Jacob began writing his name more often now, once in the morning, once before sleep, and sometimes in the middle of the day, if the quiet crept in too deep. Jacob Novak. Jacob Novak. Jacob Novak. He filled the margins with it. Some days they gave him food, some days they didn't. He wondered if his name was still on their lists. If it had ever been. Not for comfort, but out of necessity. As if writing it kept something tethered, something that otherwise might slip quietly out of reach. He had stopped speaking to the attendants. They always looked at him with polite confusion, as if they barely recognized him. The journal had become his only anchor, names he didn't recognize. But even that was changing. And next to each name, a thin line drawn through it, not by his hand. One morning, Jacob opened it to find several new pages. Not blank, but lightly filled with names written in pale gray ink. Amira, Fidel, Giovanni, Marika. Each one written once. Small and delicate, like signatures on a forgotten petition. He flipped back to the previous entries. His own handwriting was still there, frantic and sharp. But now, embedded within his writing, were occasional words he had not written. Phrases slipped between lines, woven in like thread through cloth. The walls remember. Do not sleep too long. He stood alone by the narrow windows that faced the water, staring out at the gray expanse. The sky and the ocean blurred together, like ink spilled across a page. The page pinned to the board that morning was blank. They forget you when you forget yourself. He slammed the book shut. When he opened it again minutes later, the names were gone. Only his writing remained. Later that day, Jacob wandered to the edge of the building, the part closest to the sea. Behind him, the halls were quiet. Too quiet. He turned and walked back, passing the central bulletin board, where names were sometimes posted. Names of those cleared, those processed, those rejected. No one seemed to notice. Jacob watched as a woman walked up, looked at the board, frowned, and walked away. Another man followed, did the same. No one asked why nothing was written. Another man, a boy with blonde hair, a woman with a scar on her cheek, he couldn't be sure. Their faces were fading, their names slipping through his thoughts like sand through fingers. Yes, I saw her in the hall once, and Fidel. I think he smiled at me. I don't want to forget. I don't want to be forgotten. We stepped closer. Almost too faint to see. Almost too faint to see. Was a scribble. Only names remembered are names that remain. That night, Jacob sat by the dim light of the oil lamp in the dormitory and opened his journal again. He turned to a fresh page. Before he could write anything, a soft smudge began forming in the center, like ink bleeding upward from beneath the paper. Slowly, the shape of letters emerged. Do you remember me? Jacob dropped the pen, his breath caught. When he finished, he signed his own name beneath them all, pressing the pen hard against the paper. He flipped back several pages, looking for any clue, any mention. But the question repeated on 3 different pages, in different handwriting each time. And beneath one, scrawled almost in panic, "If you forget them, they are gone." He suddenly remembered the Hungarian, and Luca from Naples, and maybe. With trembling hands, he wrote in his journal, "I remember Luca. I remember. The lamp flickered. A draft moved through the room, though no window was open. And from the foot of his bed, he thought he heard someone whisper, "Then keep writing, Jacob." He didn't sleep that night. He wrote every name he could recall, filled 3 pages. The next morning, he found the name still there, but his own had faded. It began with a sound, soft, subtle, like dripping water. Jacob first heard it 3 nights ago, just after midnight. At first he thought it was a leak, a pipe, or perhaps condensation. But it was steady, rhythmic, deliberate, like water falling into water. The doors there were locked, the paint peeling from their frames like old bark, and the windows long blackened with soot or time. Drip, drip. It came from somewhere behind the east corridor, the part of the building no one used anymore. He ignored it the first night. The second night, it grew louder. He crept from his bed, clutching the journal to his chest like armor, and slipped into the hallway. The air was colder here, not just chilly, but damp. It clung to his skin, slick and unpleasant, like he'd walked too close to the sea. By the third, he couldn't stay away. Past closed doors, most with rusted locks. But one, at the very end of the hall, was slightly ajar. That evening, Jacob waited until the dormitory was asleep. The sound guided him, a steady, echoing drip leading deeper into a wing of the building where no lamps burned. He paused. Every nerve in his body screamed to turn back. He reached for the lamp by the door and gave it a soft twist. The wick lit with a small flame, and he stepped in. The walls were stained, streaked with algae and damp marks. In the center of the room floated a single object, a dark felt hat slowly spinning. Instead, he pushed the door open. Inside was darkness, heavy and thick. The air smelled of salt and mildew. The room wasn't empty. Water covered the floor, shallow but unmistakably salt water, its surface rippling gently, though no breeze stirred. Jacob's chest tightened. Luca's hat, he lunged, pulling it free. Soaked, but intact. The ink on the last page blurred slightly, but the name at the bottom held firm. He remembered it clearly. The way Luca had joked that it was his lucky hat, the last thing his father gave him before he boarded the ship. Jacob stepped forward, the water lapping at his boots. It was cold, biting. Each step sent tiny waves across the floor. Then he saw the writing. Scrawled across the walls in dozens of handwritings were messages. Overlapping, fading, etched and rewritten over time. I never left. They forgot me. The water keeps the names. Remember us. Remember me. And again, we are still here. Jacob staggered back, the journal slipping from his hands and landing in the water with a splash. Jacob Novak. He clutched the book to his chest, heart pounding. Just endless. Lost. Like wind moving through the mouths of the forgotten. As he turned to leave, he heard something. A sound beneath the water. Not a splash. Not the drip. A voice. After several tries, he finally managed, faint, whispering Jacob. Help. The names on the wall. They are the ones who are gone, but not gone. Lucas' hat is there. His name was on the wall. The water keeps them. Another voice. A second name. Amira. And then more. Layered over each other. Voices crying out, pleading, murmuring, chanting. He couldn't move. The water stirred. The hat bumped against his leg. The whispering grew louder. Not angry, not frightening. Jacob stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He leaned against the wall, gasping. He didn't return to the dormitory that night. Instead, he sat in a stairwell until dawn, watching the shadows on the stone twist and reshape themselves. When morning came, no one noticed his absence. No one asked why he was soaked. He opened the journal and tried to write, but the page resisted, the pen scraping against it like bone on stone. The room is real, the water is real. He looked down at the next page. He hadn't turned it, but a line was already there, in a hand not his own. No one remembers your name? The water does. Jacob avoided the eastern corridor after that night. Even in daylight, the memory of the drowned room lingered. The whispers, the cold water, the words etched into the walls. The other immigrants still came and went. Some were called processed, vanished into the great machinery of America. But Jacob remained. Time on the island had softened, as if the clocks here ticked in circles instead of lines. The sunlight felt the same each morning. The air never changed. Faces blurred. Names slipped away. It stayed with him like salt on the skin, impossible to wash away. He spent his days in silence, sitting on the wooden bench near the laundry rooms where few people ever passed. It had been weeks now, he thought, or maybe longer. Now he only added names, those he remembered, those he dreamed of, those he feared were about to disappear. But the journal was still with him. It had dried, though. The pages near the center remained warped. He had stopped writing full entries. He never found Luca's name on the official lists, nor Amira S. nor S. It was as if they had never arrived. Then one morning, as he sat at his usual bench, a clerk approached. She was young, wearing round spectacles and a brown uniform with buttons that gleamed too brightly for such a tired place. She held something in her hands. "Letter for you," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. Jacob blinked. "For me." The woman nodded and walked away without another word. Island, he stared down at the envelope. Faded cream color, rough texture, no postage, no official seal. His name was scrawled on the front in neat cursive. Jacob Novak Ellis received. February 5th, 1912. Sent. October 21st, 1882, his hands went cold. He turned the envelope over. The wax seal had been broken, as if someone, or something, had already read it. No closing. Just 7 short lines, handwritten in ink so dark it almost shimmered. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no salutation. "You will not be remembered unless you fight for the memory. The water takes what is forgotten. The walls record only silence. The exact loops in the N of Novak, the sharp curl of the J. He had seen it 100 times in his journal. Write it down. Speak it often. Do not wait for them to call your name. Leave before they do." Jacob read the letter again, then a third time. It was empty. No benches, no people, just cold marble and the creaking sound of flags fluttering overhead. Amira, Giovanni, Fidel. One by one, the names were spoken and then crossed off. At the far end of the room stood the man in the black coat, the one without a shadow. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his. Not just similar, identical. But he hadn't written this. He couldn't have. He folded the paper and placed it inside the back cover of his journal. That night he dreamt again. This time, he stood in the central hall. But now, he was holding a clipboard. Jacob stepped forward, trembling. The man looked down, slowly turned the page, and began reading names aloud. names Jacob recognized from his journal. Out. He knew then that Ellis was not just a station, not just a gateway. When he reached the final page, the man looked up. He did not speak Jacob's name. He only stared. Then, with slow precision, he dipped his pen into an inkwell, blacker than midnight, and wrote something at the bottom of the page. Jacob woke with a gasp, heart racing. He grabbed the journal, flipping to the last page. There, written in the same dark ink, was a single word. Soon, he didn't sleep again that night. He walked the corridors, watched the sunrise over the harbor, and stared out toward the skyline of New York, hazy and unreachable. It was a place where time broke, where memories faded, where those not remembered remained. And now he had been warned. Jacob stopped waiting. He no longer stood in line for roll calls, no longer followed the daily routines, the inspections, the meals, the endless queues of names and questions. He had become invisible. Or perhaps the island had simply decided to stop pretending he existed. The others didn't speak to him anymore. They passed by without recognition, their eyes glassy, their footsteps mechanical. Some of them, he was certain, he had spoken with days ago, laughed with, shared stories of home. The pages thinner, as though the book itself were aging alongside him. Now they looked through him, like smoke. Jacob sat near the southern window where the afternoon sun warmed the stone floor in a long slant of gold. He flipped through his journal. The ink had grown faint. One name remained on the last page. His own no other entries had appeared since the word soon. It was the call bell, the one that signaled final clearance. And one by one, people stepped forward, eyes wide with relief, clutching their bags. Crossing over the threshold into the processing chamber, their silhouettes faded into light. One by one, names were read from a sheet, shouted into the echoing walls. Until today, that morning, a bell rang through the main hall, a sound Jacob Padan heard in what felt like weeks. A guard called each name aloud. Jacob watched from the shadows of a pillar, his heart thudding with each name. Then the bell fell silent. The guard looked down at the paper, cleared his throat, and called one final name, Alexander Noack. Jacob froze. The name was close. So close, but not his. The syllables were wrong, the cadence off. A twisted echo of who he was. He stepped forward, then stopped. No one else moved. The name was called again, but it no longer sounded like English or Polish or anything he could decipher. Just hollow noise. Jacob looked down at his journal, opened it to the last page. Only now it was louder, more insistent, closer. His name was gone, not scratched out, not faded, simply missing. A blank space where once it had been written dozens, hundreds of times. He turned the pages. Nothing, not even the older entries remained. The names, the sketches, the whispers, the book was empty. Then he heard it. There were no locked doors anymore, no schedules, no guards. He passed rooms filled with empty beds, corridors that echoed with nothing but the sound of his own breath, not the bell. Not a voice, not words, but shapes. Lines, a boat on a river, face half remembered. The outline of a name he couldn't quite recall, but a whisper. The same one he had heard in the drowned room. Dust rose in soft clouds, disturbed by her steps. She leafed through drawers of yellowed papers, long forgotten. It spoke in fragments. The city across the water shimmered like a dream he'd once had. He felt no urge to reach it now. Names, places, memories, all drifting just out of reach. And then, you may stay now. He did not return to the dormitory. Instead, Jacob walked the halls of the island freely. Time unraveled. He could no longer remember when he had arrived, or why. He took to sitting on a bench in the western wing, a place no one visited, and watched the horizon. Sometimes he would write in the journal again. One evening, many years or minutes later, a new clerk opened the old records room in the basement of the station. She found a journal, tucked behind a broken filing cabinet. Inside, every page was blank, except for the first one. There, in faint water-stained ink, were 5 words. My name was Jacob Novak, and beneath it a smaller line. I stayed too long.